What is up, everyone? Today we are looking at some interesting new cards from Murders at Karlov Manor. I want to talk today about a little bit of power creep and design changes and things that Wizards of the Coast are doing in their new sets. Some good, some bad. So yeah, let's get into it. Alrighty, starting off, we're looking at this card, though they went this way. It's 2 and a green. Search your library for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle, and then you investigate. So we've seen this kind of card many, many times in the past where it's 3 mana, you look in your deck for a land, you put it on the battlefield tapped, and then you shuffle, and then that's it. So um, sometimes it will say basic land, sometimes it will say any land. Sometimes it will be like a 1/1 creature that looks at the top 6 cards of your library to put a land on the battlefield. Something like that. So it's always about the same. Basically 3 mana, fetch a land, put it onto the battlefield is a pretty standard rate. This time they decided to staple investigate onto it. So it's kind of like how we had shock and they changed it to play with fire, which gave you like a scry 1 when you shoot the opponent in the face. There's a few of these cards where they've been testing the power level, if they could raise the power level, power creeping, so to speak. But they realize that they've power crept creatures so far that they kind of need to power creep spells a little bit, instead of trying to power creep the level of creatures back down, which I really think they could do. But I kind of get the feeling that they want more standard cards to be playable in older formats in order to make more profits, basically. So the way to do that is to raise the level of standard cards a bit so that they have the potential. Every once in a while, some of them will have the potential to be older format playables. So that's what I think they're doing, and that's why they're experimenting with power creeping some of the standard cards. So there you have it. This one is, that's kind of typical thing for 3 mana, but they stapled investigate on it to give you that little advantage of getting a card back at some point in the future. Um, I don't really see a problem with this one, because they did limit it to basic land cards. If it was any land, it would be a little bit more dangerous. But basic land, not too scary. Investigating off of it seems relatively safe, not too crazy. So that's why I don't think this is like a super bomb card. But I just wanted to point out that, yeah, they are power creeping it. It is, interesting that they're trying this with investigate, giving a little bit of advantage back. Basically, so you never have an empty hand because you always have stuff to draw at some point. All right, next one, Aurelia, the Law Above. So this one is not too crazy, but I did wanted to mention this card because it's 5 mana, it's flying, vigilant, and haste, and it has a lot of text on it. Whenever a power player attacks with 3 or more creatures, you draw a card. It doesn't say other creatures, so that includes Aurelia. So if you have 2 creatures, you put Aurelia down, you swing in, it has haste, right? So you swing in and you draw a card. And then if you have 5 or more, you also drain the opponent for 3. Um, I don't think this card is that good because, it dies to removal. But I do think that they have been printing a lot of cards like this in recent years where it kind of asks you to have a few creatures in your board state and then swing in and you get some like trigger effect. And so I think this card is, potentially good, potentially interesting, good finisher for Boros, maybe. Um, and so I thought it was just worth mentioning that it's kind of, it's something to look out for, but I don't think it's quite at the right power level to be a standard staple. All right, next one, Axebane Ferox, 2 green green, for a 4/4 with Death Touch and Haste. Key thing there is haste. A lot of times they don't give you the haste, so it's a little bit similar to Questing Beast, not as good as Questing Beast, but similar. But it does have this ward effect, which is what makes it interesting. So ward, collect evidence 4. So early game, potentially on turn 4, your opponent may not have anything in their graveyard. If that's the case, then they can never kill this creature because they can't collect evidence for it to kill it. Also, if the opponent is collecting their own evidence, or you have other creatures which they had to pay this evidence tax essentially, then they might not be able to kill it. So there is a real potential that this ward could turn into essentially hexproof, especially very early on in the game. So I think, that's what makes this kind of interesting. Like against control, I mean, hopefully the control player would have like drawn cards or something early on so that they got at least a few spells in the graveyard. But let's say green goes first. Yeah, the control player doesn't do anything turn 2. Turn 3, they use like quick study, right? They draw 2 cards. They get a 3 CMC card in their graveyard. Well, 3 CMC is not enough to collect evidence for, so they can't actually kill this creature. So yeah, I think it's potentially could be pretty hard to deal with this creature, at least early on in the game. Though we do have some new spells that say can't be countered, which can get through the ward. Um, but yeah, I just thought it was interesting they're experimenting with new ward effects, even using the new mechanics in the set, like evidence here, to make it tougher to kill. Yeah, like I don't know if you're like a soldier's deck, right? You might not have a bunch of spells. You just have creatures on the board. You can't really fight a 4/4 Death Touch Haster with your soldier creatures, and you have nothing in your graveyard, so you can't use your removal either. Essentially, then you can't stop this creature. So pretty interesting. We see there's another effect like this in one of the black cards, which is maybe we're gonna look at it later, but it's like ward sacrifice a creature. Well, the control deck may not have a creature, so they can just never kill that other creature, but essentially as hexproof for our control decks. All right. Well, next up we have Barbed Servitor, 3 and a black for a 1/1 indestructible. Whenever it enters the battlefield, suspect it, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. Whenever Barbed Servitor is dealt damage, target opponent loses that much life. This is kind of a conjunction of 2 cards. We got Toski, I think it's called Toski. It was like a squirrel creature that whenever you deal combat damage to an opponent, you would draw cards. It was also a 4 mana 1/1 indestructible creature, and it couldn't block, I believe. No, it had to attack each combat if possible. So it could block, but it had to attack. So basically, it can't block. Very similar to this. This is 4/4 1 mana, sorry, 4/4 1/1 indestructible that can't block, that deals combat damage to a player and it draws you a card. It's definitely a little bit weaker than Toski. However, it has that last line of text that whenever it's dealt damage, the opponent loses that much life, which is similar to Brash Taunter, a red card that we had, which I think was 5 mana for a 1/1 with indestructible that said whenever it is dealt damage, target opponent loses that much life. So it's kind of in between Toski and Brash Taunter. Might mean that it's not as good as either one because it's not really fulfilling the same roles as either of those. But like, because Brash Taunter, you could block with it, and nobody can attack in, or they're going to take a bunch of damage. So this is definitely not quite as good as either one, but it's somewhere in the middle. And there are a few cards in the set which lets you remove the suspect text from your creatures. So if you cast one of those cards, you get rid of suspect on this one, and then now it can suddenly start blocking because it no longer is suspected. Then potentially that could be very good. So early game, you could use it to get a few cards because it has menace and indestructible. And then maybe a few turns later, you can remove the suspect and treat it as a blocker. So I don't really think it's going to be good enough, but I do think it is very interesting that they tried to make this kind of effect on this creature. In black, does it make sense in black? I guess it's fine in black, though indestructible on a black creature is a little bit strange. We see it sometimes, but it's usually a white trait. Yeah, I can't. Trying to think if I can think of any other creature that's black with indestructible, but nothing is coming to mind. But there's tons of white creatures that are indestructible. So, I even think there's a bunch of red-white creatures that have indestructible. So, I'm not sure. Either way, they made this kind of interesting card that you have to kind of like play around in your deck, like construct your deck around it to make it work. And potentially could be good, but it's hard to see where it would fit or how it's going to work out. Next up, Clandestine Meddler, 2 and a black. This card also not that great, but it is interesting. So that's why it's in this interesting discussion. So when it enters the battlefield, suspect up to one other target creature. So you choose another creature to basically get menace and can't block. And then whenever one or more suspected creatures you control attack, surveil one. So you hopefully have a 1 mana or 2 mana creature on the board. You suspect it. Now it can't be blocked easily because it has a menace. And then whenever it attacks, you get to surveil. And so we used to have in the old Ravnica sets some like payoffs for surveil. But the biggest problem was that we didn't have enough cards that actually surveilled. It was like a keyword that they didn't print very much for some reason. So it made it a little bit tricky. But now, if you have something like this, where every time you attack, you get to surveil on potentially a 2 CMC creature, it makes it a lot more viable. And I know there's a bunch of commander cards which pay off for surveil, so maybe this is better in commander, but I do think it is interesting that they've started to print surveil on cheaper and easier to play cards. Even the land cycle has surveil in this set, which, you know, that's just another way you can trigger your surveil. So things like Disinformation Campaign, which were super cool but needed more cards that could surveil to trigger it, now potentially could be a lot better. So I find that very cool. I hope they have more surveil stuff in the future. I really like surveil as a mechanic. I think it's just one of the funnest things to do in Magic for me. Like, scrying is cool and all, but it doesn't really do much. It just lets you fix your draw selection a little bit. Surveil has so many implications. Like, do I put it in my graveyard? Do I not? You know, what's the benefit to having it there? Maybe you can build your deck around putting stuff in your graveyard. So yeah, very cool. So yeah, I thought it was a cool design. Next up, Conspiracy Unraveler. This is 5 and a blue for 6/6. This card is really cool, but it's very expensive. And the reason why it's potentially good, even though it's so expensive, is because it has this line of text here. You may collect evidence 10 rather than playing the mana cost for spells that you cast. So if you can get this down, cheat this out maybe somehow with reanimation or use Lazov to copy it potentially, then you can start to cast a bunch of spells for free-ish. You do have to have cards in your graveyard, so hopefully you've been milling yourself a few turns before you get this down, so that you have evidence or casting spells. I mean, if you play it on turn 7, you're definitely going to have cards in your graveyard. But if you cheat it out on like turn 4, then you probably need to have some sort of mill deck that reanimates. And hopefully the mill will hit enough to get you 10 CMC worth of evidence in your graveyard. The new split cards do count as like double, like both sides count as mana. So most of those are 8 CMC total, which is very good for stuff like this. So if you can have some of the split cards in your deck with this that you're milling, potentially, you can make this a lot easier. Or if you mill a bunch of giant creatures to reanimate, then you're gonna have a bunch of large CMC creatures in your graveyard to count as evidence. So potentially you could get this out, have a bunch of giant creatures in your graveyard, giant creatures in your hand, and then you just start casting your entire hand because you know you have enough evidence to cast like 2 or 3 spells from your hand. So maybe, yeah, maybe this is good with like Atraxa. Like, you get this out on turn 4 with reanimation, and then you can play Atraxa from your hand for free. So it's definitely an interesting design, something that can be probably abused in either standard or older formats in some way. but it's going to take some real ingenuity to make this thing work. Next up, demand answers. I thought this was interesting because this is essentially a black card that they've printed into red. And they've never done this before. This is the first time they've ever done this in red. So it's 1 in a red, instant speed. As an additional cost to cast a spell, sacrifice an artifact or discard a card, then draw 2 cards. So we had something similar to this in black, where it was sacrifice an artifact or creature, then draw 2 cards at instant speed. And we have like Village Rites, which is sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards for 1 mana, 1 black mana. So they had said, you know, this is one of the things that Mark Rosewater, he'll say one thing and then he'll print cards like this. So it's very hard to know what he's really thinking. For example, he said that they were trying to make red not do card draw and instead get card advantage in other ways, such as playing off the top of your library or exiling cards that you can play, you know, this turn or the next turn. Because red is like the, what did he say? Like time limited color. Like, it's all about doing stuff now, doing stuff in the moment, and not like long lasting advantage. So he said that, but then they print something like this. So this is clearly like a pretty good card because either one, it's just like a tormenting voice, where you discard a card and you draw 2, or it's you get to sacrifice an artifact, which probably the artifact you don't even care about. It could be like a 1/1 token, or it could be like a blood token, and then you sacrifice that and you draw 2 cards. So it's clearly very good, and I won't say it's a bomb card. I mean, you have to have the right deck to put this in, but it's the first time they put this in red, so it's interesting that they've kind of changed their design a little bit on red and allowed this to be in there. I guess they're thinking this is kind of like a Rakdos card, but they didn't print it as a red black card. It's just a straight up red card, so I don't know. Anyway, I mean, you can argue with me. You can say Tormenting Voice exists, so this is just like it's just a power crept Tormenting Voice, which I guess you're right in that sense. But as I mentioned, Mark Rosewater had said that they weren't going to print these anymore. Like, they were going to do more time limited card advantage for reds, and then they printed this. So either way, my point is it's a little bit of a change in design, a little bit of power creep. So it's kind of an interesting card. Maybe we won't see something like this again for a while. Maybe they're just playing around with things. So that's why I wanted to bring this up. Next up, Etrada, Deadly Fugitive. 1 blue and a black for a 1/4 with Death Touch. Face down creatures you control have 2 blue and a black. Turn this face up. If you can't, exile it. And then you may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost. And then whenever an assassin you control deals combat damage to an opponent, cloak the top card of that player's library. I think this card is interesting. It could be good, potentially, because people don't want to block it because of the Death Touch. And if you had some sort of combat tricks in your deck, could make it even more dangerous. So you might be able to get card advantage off this in some way. Like maybe you could have Slip Out the Back or Hexproof or something to pump it and also protect it. And then you get card advantage from your opponent's deck. And then that line about flipping up creatures, flip face on creatures you control, you know, you can flip them up without paying their mana cost. Pretty cool because you could flip up like a giant creature, essentially. So yeah, I think it's cool. I was thinking you could cast non-creatures, but it doesn't look like it. So it's still only creatures that you can flip up with the disguise mechanic or the cloak mechanic. But the design is interesting. I do really wish the Dimir stat line creatures, like the stat line of Dimir creatures, was a little bit better. Like a 1/4 for 3 manas. Not very appealing. 2/4 would be nice. I don't know if a 2/3 would be better with Death Touch. I think with Death Touch, maybe a 1/4 is better than a 2/3, but it just seems like it's not that playable. Dice to removal, but the payoff is quite good. It's similar to like Thief of Sanity, which was really cool. That one has evasion. This one, I guess this one has like pseudo evasion because Death Touch. So maybe it will be the next Thief of Sanity. Could be. If I'll be very happy if it is. You know, obviously if somebody plays it against me and I can't kill it, I'll be sad. But yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting design. I'm really glad that they've kind of gone back to this sort of thing for Dimir. Like, this is what, for me, this is Dimir. This kind of thing where Dimir kind of subverts your expectation of how to play the game. Like, you get stuff from the opponent's deck, you get stuff from the graveyard, you like transform your creatures. It's all about like deception and playing the game in an unusual way, not just beating your opponent's face down. So yeah, I really love this card. I think it's very, very sweet. Next up, extract a confession. 1 and a black. As an additional cost to cast a spell, you may collect evidence 6. Each opponent sacrifices a creature. If evidence was collected instead, each opponent sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among creatures they control. So 2 mana edict. If you collect evidence, it becomes even better edict that sacrifices the greatest power creature. Just a little bit of a power creep. We had that effect in 3 mana where you could sacrifice the greatest power among creatures they control for 3 mana. So now you can do it at 2 if you collect the evidence. So that's pretty much it. Straightforward. Next one, get a leg up. Till end of turn, target creature gets +1/+1 for each creature you control and gains reach. Interesting because we had this ability, I believe, like really long time ago in like one of the earliest sets in Magic, and we haven't really seen it again. And I think it didn't have reach. I think it was just +1/+1 for each creature you control. So the fact that it has reach is also another advantage. So yeah, they're kind of bringing back one of the really old, powerful kind of combat tricks, which I don't think it will see play outside of Limited, but in Limited, this will probably be very good. Next one, hard-hitting question. Green, target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. This is a bite spell, and it's 1 mana. This is the first time we've ever seen this as well. It's always been 2 mana for bites, 1 mana for fights at the minimum. And so yeah, this is a power crept bite spell, and it's probably pretty good because fight always has the downside that you could lose your own creature if your power's not big enough. Next one, Living Conundrum. Another very, very cool creature, 4 and a blue. It's a way to win the game when you've milled yourself out or you've ran out of cards. It's essentially 5 mana for 2/5 with hexproof, so it's hard to kill. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards, skip your draw instead. And then as long as there are no cards in your library, this is a 10/10 with flying and vigilance. So you kind of don't mind if you're like getting through your entire deck, either milling or drawing everything, because it will prevent you from losing the game. And then it also becomes like a really powerful two-turn finisher once you have no cards. So there's a deck in Historic, Tainted Pact, I think it's called, where you like try to mill out your whole deck and then play Oracle, Thassa's Oracle to win the game. I guess essentially you could do something similar to that, and you won't you won't lose from having no cards, but you'll not have a 10/10 that's hard to kill. So Shield's Edict does get around it. Any Edict effect could get potentially get around it, but you would have a 2-turn clock, so it is pretty cool. I don't really see this scene play right now, but in a format where control can draw a lot of cards, which we've had in the past, I think this would be good to have like as of one of in your deck. So you know, at some point get down to where you have almost nothing in your deck, then you play this, you won't mill out, and opponent really can't kill it, and you have a way to kind of win the game. So it's cool, very cool design, but probably not good enough for standard. Next, Massacre Girl, 2 and a black menace. Whenever creatures you control have wither, meaning that deal damage to creatures in -1/-1 counters. And then whenever a creature your opponent controls dies, if its toughness was less than 1, you draw a card. And it's a 4/4. This one is probably good enough to see play in standard, but you kind of need to figure out the right shell for it. And I really think it's cool that they put Wither on this Massacre Girl. I think I really like that they're adding keywords from old sets into the new sets. I think they should do that a lot more. It really makes the game more interesting and more fun. And this whole package works pretty well together. It seems like you get kind of permanent damage with Massacre Girl because of the -1/-1 counters. So even if your creatures die, it's good. So yeah, I think this card will see play, but I wanted to bring it up here because it's just a really interesting card. Not on my watch. 1 and a white is instant speed, exile, target attacking creature. Target attacking creature. I believe this is the first time we've ever seen this effect at 2 mana on an instant speed card. We've seen 2 mana instant speed destroy target attacking creature. We've seen 2 mana instant speed destroy tapped creature. I think have we even seen a 1 mana destroy target attacking creature, but exile, this is the first time that exile has been this cheap at instant speed. So yeah, I just wanted to mention here, they've power crept it to see if it's too good or not. So we'll see. Probably it's not too good, because attacking creature is such a limiting keyword on there that usually that makes the removals not work out. All right, Slime Against Humanity. This is a card you can have as many as you want in your deck. It's 2 and a green, and you create a 0/0 ooze creature token with trample. Put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the total number of cards you own in exile and in your graveyard that are oozes or named Slime Against Humanity. So you probably want to mill yourself a bunch, then cast this, and you could get like a really, really large ooze creature. And if your whole deck is this card, then, you know, you can just keep casting giant creatures every turn for 3 mana. So it has potential to be good. Again, you have to build the right deck around it, but it is an interesting card. They have other stuff like this in the past that was not quite this good. So this is definitely one of the better ones they've made like this. So we'll have to see. Could potentially be a very good card. And the last one, the Pride of Hull Clade, 10 and a green. And this reminds me of Gigantha. Not Gigantha. Oh man, not Gigantha. This reminds me of the I forget his name. He's a giant green dinosaur that was in the last set. I'll think of it later. But it used to get cheaper for the more power of creatures you had on the battlefield. And this one is similar because it says this costs X less to cast, where X is the total toughness of creatures you control. And so if you have a bunch of big toughness creatures, this gets really, really cheap. This has Defender, unfortunately. So 2/15 Defender. But for 2 blue, creatures you control get +1/+0. And whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card equal to its toughness. Draw cards equal to its toughness, and can attack as though it didn't have Defender. So if you can get, like on turn 1, 2, and 3, some pretty high toughness creatures with low attacks, and then you get this maybe on turn 4, something like that. Turn 5, you do 2 blue. You're swinging in with all your stuff. You probably would draw too many cards. Yeah, you might honestly draw too many cards, because if you get cards equal to its toughness, I mean, you'd get 15 cards from this, which I don't think you want that many cards. So that probably makes this unplayable, or maybe you just can't attack in with this particular creature. But I mean, in theory, let's say turn 1, 2. Yeah, you'd have to play this like on turn 5. So turn 1, 2, 3, 4, you play a bunch of big creatures with high toughness. and then turn 5 you play this for 1 mana, and you activate the ability. So even though this one can't attack and the other ones all can, and you get a bunch of cards. Maybe that's the way to do it. I don't know. You have to think about it. You have to build around it, but it's an interesting card. It's going to be very hard to deal with for the opponent. All right, that's it. Those are the interesting cards for the new set. Probably not standard playable, but very interesting. Maybe build arounds. And so I wanted to mention them. That's going to be all for the spoilers for the new set. We'll have the new brews coming up next week. And then the very next week after that, we have the new set coming out. So hope you are looking forward to that. And until next time, see ya.